This is sort of an overwhelming occasion, folks. I can hardly wait to see what the 100th birthday would be like. As I listened to Michael, I had Dorothy in my mind because I know she had Michael come up and play at some of our services years ago. You've come a long way, said Michael. Beautiful. Thank you. And Sharon, thank you for your support. And of course, my thanks to the board for wanting to invite me, and to Cherie, my child. It's a very, very wonderful, wonderful experience. I am so richly blessed. I need to get out what I came here to say, because there's some things I've been pondering for some time. Since I think I last saw you about 4 or 5 months ago. Maybe it was longer than that. Anyway, I pondered deeply since I've left you, and I've wondered why it is that every time you clean something, you just make something else dirty. Have you ever pondered that? See, I haven't given a talk since I left here. All I do is sit around and ponder things like, 100 years ago, do you know that everyone owned a horse and only the very wealthy had a car? Now, only the very wealthy own a horse and everybody else drives a car. I mean, that is confusing. More seriously, I've wondered if most twins ever realize that one of them is unplanned. And then, last of all, I've pondered the question of whether the dog really thinks you're... Wait a minute, I got that wrong. What if my dog, I've really pondered this one, what if my dog only brings back the ball because he or she thinks I like throwing it? So you can tell I've been very busy on deep matters. How many of you know why I went to Reno? I suspected that nobody knows why I went to Reno. And so I want to weave that into my sharing today, so it'll be rather personal about my life, but I think I can make share a message that will have great meaning for you personally. I want to begin by affirming what is the very essence and core of my personal ministry, and that has been that every one of us has a very personal relationship to God. And again, that's sort of basic Christianity, but in terms of our metaphysical field, sometimes we lose sight of that truth, and even for those who have always claimed it as a part of their faith, it isn't always really acted upon. To know that you personally are very special to God. And again, I don't know how to get into this, but to say, do you really know how special you are to God? Not just Phil Pierson or some other great spiritual leader, or, oops, I was about to say the President of the United States. Any great personality like that, every one of us literally is personal to God. And I've given lessons on this and affirmed for you that you have a connection to God by your appreciating that and loving God with all your heart and soul and mind. And that again is a word we all hear so often, but to act upon it is like, what was that? Alibaba, something I learned as a kid, you know, open sesame. The open sesame of your spiritual life is to take the time to literally love God with all your heart and soul and mind. When you do that, then you open a channel which allows this universal intelligence that knows everything about you and me and what's going on in the world to move your life where your life can best serve and be served in every area of life. Your prosperity, your health, etc. I preface that to telling you why I'm in Reno. To do that, I want to back up a minute and tell you how I got into the ministry. I've told you that story, so I'm going to give it to you in sort of capsule form. When I was about 25, I was a hotshot in the oil business. I went into the oil business because one of my best friends and I had decided we were going to save America and the world, and that the best way to do it was to get into politics, where we could be heard. And so to do that, we decided we had to make money. Well, it happened that his father had founded National Oil and Refining Company, which became one of the largest oil companies in the country. And he said to me, "You go to work for my dad's company." We were seniors at college at the time. He said, "You go to work for my dad's company, and I'll go to work for Standard of Ohio," because he knew the chairman of the board of the Standard of Ohio through his dad. And so he said, "And then we'll get into politics and make things happen." So I went to work for National Oil and Refining Company. And so at the age of 25, I said I was rocking and rolling. I had my own secretaries in charge of millions of dollars of products out of one of our major terminals in Paducah, Kentucky, of all places. And I was fairly newly married, and 3 years married. And due to my ill-begotten ways, I think that's what I call it, my wife decided to go home. And this was a great shock to the boy Wonder, that suddenly he had lost his wife, and I had my daughter at that time. And so it made me do something I'd really never done before. I'd studied the Bible like most of us do when we go to church and Sunday school. But I picked up the Bible and began to read it for the first time because I really needed some answers about me and about life. And as I did, I discovered that this man Jesus was saying that I'm like him. And then when he said we could do all things, I knew he was saying that that's a real possibility for every one of us. In any event, it turned me on so that I had this sense of my oneness with God so strongly that I knew I had to share this with people and I had to go in the ministry. And so I announced to my immediate superiors that I was leaving the oil business. Well, when Paul Blazer, who was the chairman of the board of National Oil Refining Company, and his wife, who I'd known personally through their son and been at weddings in the family, anyway, they called me and said, "Fly over to Ashland and we want you to have dinner with us." So I went there and we had a rather non-committal dinner. And then Paul invited me to go into his study. And I still remember we sat around the fireplace and he said, "You know," and I hadn't told you this, my good friend Stu had gone into the Army and officers training school, and on his first combat mission in Korea, he was killed. So as I sat with Paul, he said, "You know, since Stu left," he said, "I've been counting on you to sort of someday take the reins." I looked at him and I said, "I am so honored by this, but I can't do it. I can't do it." It wasn't my intellect that was saying it. It was something in here that said, "I can't do that. I've got to share this message. So anyway, I've told you that story, and as you know, I left the oil business and went into the ministry. However, as I'm sure you remember my stories of the past, it took me 4 years after that before I found unity. And in that time, I served time in the army in France. I did a number of rather menial kind of things, and my intellect kept saying, do you remember when he said, you can have the reins someday of this oil company? And I said, no, I've got to go in the ministry. And so I hung on, and after 4 years I found unity. So anyway, bringing us more up to date, some of you remember when we began this ministry that I had said to the board, I want to go to Unity School and serve, and the CEO position is open there, and I'm applying for that. And they said, well, that's okay, we'll just put it in the hands of the Spirit, but let's start this ministry, which we did. And then for those of you who were a part of it from the beginning, we shared the progress in that from time to time. And I didn't get the CEO's position. Somehow, I don't know why they couldn't give me a 5-year contract when I was 89, but I applied anyway. And didn't get it. And so we said, okay, we'll settle down now, we're going to build this church. And then lo and behold, Jim Blake, a fellow named Jim Blake, was appointed the new chief executive officer for Unity School. I thought, Jim, when I was the vice president there, Jim and I served together, we were really close. And so we had some contact, and I then told the board again, well, I think maybe Spirit's wanting me to go back because I could work with Jim. And so Jim eventually said to me, if you come back to the school, he said, you can live in Rick Fillmore, who was the founder's son, home right on the golf course. And he said, you can live there free. And he said, all I want you to do is be available to me, counsel, etc. And you can do anything else you want, but no obligations beyond that. I knew that they probably wanted me there because I'm one of the few people that knew the Fillmore sons, all except Myrtle and Charles, who were the founders. But I knew their sons very well, and there aren't that many of us who did. And through Dorothy, I actually knew Charles Fillmore because she shared so much with me. So I would have been there. So when they invited people to come and consider giving large donations to the school, they said, we want you to have lunch with Phil Pierson. He knew the Fillmores. I knew that was a role for me, and I was ready to go. And so I told the board, Spirit has called me. I've got to go. Reminiscent of the days when I left the oil company, because I loved the group. I loved you. I loved the board. We were having such a marvelous time. But I knew I had to go. And then one day, I read that a new person had been appointed to be the head of Silent Unity, which is a very responsible position there. And they had written a book that said, How to Pray Without Talking to God. I thought, how to pray without talking to God? That's all I do. And so that made me question whether Spirit was really telling me to go back to Unity School. So I called Jim Blake, and I said, Jim, I've got some reservations about this. I've read this book, and I'm not certain that I'm on the same wavelength with this particular executive that you've hired, and I don't want to be in conflict in any way there. And he said, I think you're close. He said, I'll fly out. We'll talk about this. And I thought, bless his heart, he'd fly out. It means that much to him. I said, okay, I'll come, forget it. Now the intellect is working, see. But in my heart, at the last moment, just before we hung up, I said, have this person call me, who wrote the book. And so he said, okay, I will. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I get this call from this person. And as I talked, I got that feeling that some of you I know can relate to when you have had this communion with Spirit that is working through your intuitive and sort of sinks into your feeling nature that keeps you from responding intellectually to anything. And as I talked to this lady, I knew intellectually what she was saying was true, because she was saying the same thing. I know your work, I know you, I know we're not that far apart. But something in me said, no, I can't. Wow. Just like when I sat with Paul Blazer at Ashland Oil, I can't. And I know some of you here, maybe all of you, have had the similar experience where you're allowing this intuitive guidance to take over and not your intellect. So in any event, I said, okay, I'm not going back to Unity School. I called Jim, and of course by now he says, come on. I said, no, this is it. I won't bother you anymore. We're out of here. And so I better shorten up this talk, I see. Anyway, I said, okay, I'm not going back to the school. But then I suddenly realized, wait a minute. I helped the guy who owns the house I'm renting to rent it to the new renters. And so I called him and I said, have you already rented the house? Oh yeah, I've rented the house. I said, I got to move. And then I realized that I already had said goodbye to the board, and we'd had a send-off, and I'd welcomed Cherie and was so thrilled that Cherie could take over the work because she's such a great minister. And I thought, I can't go back to the church either. I got to get out of town. I mean, literally, it is funny, but literally I realized I can't stay here. It isn't healthy for old ministers to hang around. And so in any event, I thought, where will I go? And so again, the intuitive thought, well, I have friends in Reno, and it's sort of halfway between my daughter who lives in Malibu and my niece is like a daughter who lives in Seattle. So I went to Reno. I said, I'll explore Reno if that's a good idea. Well, again, as you know how it works, I may go over a little bit here. I thought, if I'm supposed to go to Reno, the doors will open. So I get on the internet as I found other places that lived, and I saw a couple of houses that sounded very interesting. And I called Donna Manti, who's an old friend of mine and the minister in Reno, Unity minister, and I told her about these two houses. She said, I'll look them, scout them out for you and tell you what I think. So she looked at one and she called me on the phone. Said, I looked at this one, and it's interesting, nice view, but not impressive. She said, I'm on my way to see the other one. A little later she calls me back and she said, I was driving over to see the other one when I suddenly realized there's something about that address. And then she said, it suddenly hit her, I lived on that street. And she said, that was the best place I ever lived in terms of convenience and everything else. And so she looked at the house and said, I think you'll like it. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, it's a beautiful house overlooking the city of Reno. The rent had just come down because it turns out the people who own it must be multimillionaires. They own that house, they own a house in Santa Barbara, they own a house way out on the end of Long Island. If you know who lives out there, nobody lives out there who hasn't got lots of money. And so I live in this lovely house at a very reasonable rent, cheaper than here in Sacramento. It's 2,700 square feet. And when I have things like the filter for the water thing wasn't working, so and they don't use a management. Debbie, the wife, handles this personally. I don't know why, but she does. Anyway, I called Debbie and I said, this filter thing is a little tough to get. And she said, I'll buy you a new one. Bought a new refrigerator. Anything I mention, they get it new for me. So I'm telling you all that to say, do I belong in Reno? Right. Everything just fell in place. It's wonderful, except for one thing. I don't know what I'm doing there. Now I want you to remember, this is an important part of everything I've told you leading up to this. It's just like when I left the oil business and said, I'm going in the ministry. I didn't never heard of Unity. I didn't know what I was doing. I tried to go in the Episcopal Church, which I was in, and got turned off by the bishop. And so anyway, I floated for 4 years without really knowing what I was doing. My intellect would say, you've really messed this up. But suddenly, the door opened, and I won't tell you that wonderful story, how I found Unity. And from then on, it's been the glory road. I have loved every day of my Unity ministry. So, I know that. So when I find myself saying, what am I doing here in Reno? I think, hang in, Dad. Hang in. Because the best is yet to be. And this is my final word. To sort of cement that, to show you how personal Spirit works. This morning when I looked at my email, or actually it was last night, I looked at my email. And here was an email from Jim Blake. We've had a couple things because I sent him some thoughts about Daily Word and stuff, but nothing other than that. But yesterday, when I looked at my email, here was an email from Jim Blake, the CEO at Unity School. And Jim said, I have the feeling that you don't look at Facebook very much, and so I wanted you to know what I put on Facebook today. And it was all dedicated to me. He didn't know it was my birthday or anything. It was dedicated to me, but mostly to the word I just spoke to you. The best is yet to be. And he was just affirming that that's what we all need to know. So let me join you with a moment of prayer and give thanks for the incredible truth that every one of us is special to God. No one is better than anyone else. We're just each special to God. And the intimacy of that relationship will take us where we need to be and fulfill the needs of our life in wonderful ways. No blessed presence, we give thanks for this truth. Thank you, God. Amen.